Yo, one day, around 6 years ago, one of my best friends Liam told me to buy this game called Dark Souls 3 so we could play it together. I had never heard of Dark Souls before, and I would have been around 13 years old at the time. I did whatever I could to get my hands on this game, and after sufficient bugging and probably a few extra chores, my mom finally caved and bought it for me. I was ecstatic. I loaded it up for the first time, excited to try out a new game with my friend, only to learn we can't play together until I beat the first boss. No biggie though, right? I've beaten countless tutorials before being able to play co-op in other games. Why would this be an issue? Well, Mr. Gundyr clearly took offense to this as he proceeded to pound my cheeks for the next hour or two, though eventually I would claim victory and proceed to Firelink Shrine. The characters I met in Firelink were funny and memorable, but there's one line of dialogue in particular that's been burned into my memory, and I'm sure many others.
Ashen One, be sure to bring more souls.
After plunging the coiled sword in the shrine bonfire, I would fast travel for the first time and get introduced to the very unique co-op system in the Souls series, summon signs and phantoms. Seeing Liam's summon sign appear on the ground in my game for the first time was the start of something incredible, something I don't even have the words to describe. After I summoned him, we spent a solid amount of time just exploring and dying. At first, the game felt so confusing and difficult, but since I had a friend to help guide me through my first playthrough, I was never too lost. I started to feel more comfortable with the game and its mechanics after a few days. Then suddenly, out of nowhere, I was completely hooked. We powered through the game and played what felt like every single day. We took down the Crystal Sage and went to the Cathedral of the Deep. There we encountered giants and some little worm guys. But for some reason, the floor was completely covered in poo. At the end of the cathedral, we found the deacons, and they had to be the easiest boss we would ever encounter. I didn't even die a single time to them. Once the deacons were down, I would reach one of the first massive hurdles and skill checks. The swamp. Nowadays, when I have to go through the swamp, I know the route for the candles and it's not too bad of an area, but back then, on my first playthrough, it was sick torture. Luckily, I had Liam to accompany me through this disgusting and horrifying area, and eventually we would reach the Abyss Watchers. Such an awesome boss. The outfit, music, and lore are all amazing, and it's just such a badass fight. I basically loved everything about this boss, and beating them was especially satisfying since they are the first Lord of Cinder you encounter. After some jolly exploration through the catacombs, and a handful of deaths later, Liam and I encountered and took down High Lord Wolnir, and were promptly greeted by the beautiful view of Irithyll. This place felt massive, and was such an insane change in the environment I had experienced up until this point. The colors, architecture, and enemies all felt alien to what I had experienced prior, in a good way of course. We made our way across the bridge and through the streets of Irithyll, and eventually made it to Pontiff Sullivan. He was brutal, and managed to cause Liam and I intense frustration. I remember spending many hours dying and learning, only to finally beat him, and immediately run into another huge problem. Aldrich, Devourer of Gods, and all of his dirty disciples that kept invading and killing me. After finally making my way past the invaders up to Aldrich, I would really struggle to beat him. His rain of arrows and life hunt scythe had me absolutely geeking, but after many hours I'd eventually beat him too. After some backtracking through Irithyll, we found the Irithyll dungeon. I remember this little area in particular confusing the hell out of me for some reason. Liam must have told me about the Path of the Dragon gesture and where to use it because I never would have figured it out on my own. We found ourselves in Dragonland, and it was dope as hell. We fought dragons, and I got a bunch of smithing stones. Titanite. Anyway, we ran into this guy called the Nameless King, and he kicked my ass. I know I struggled on a lot of bosses on my first run, but this one in particular was the hardest for me in the base game by far. The only two bosses that were harder for me than the Nameless King were Freed and goddamn Adir, who is by far one of, if not the hardest boss I've ever had to endure fighting in any video game ever. But somehow, I managed to take down the Nameless King, and head back to Irithyll Dungeon to take out poor Yorm. Rest in peace, buddy. After doing so, it was time to fight the last Lord of Cinder. But first, the dancer had to take a quick dump all over us. We struggled a little bit with the spinny Beyblade moves, then made our way through Lothric Castle, which is such a cool area. There's tons to look at, and all the colors here are also so on point. After a little while, we pulled up on Dragon Slayer Armor, one of my personal favorite bosses in Dark Souls 3. His fight never fails to feel intense to this day, and his design is immaculate. The armor, massive cleaver, and shield are all very memorable, and the fight itself is really great too. But of course, he had to be put down so we could move on. I've spent countless hours here farming souls over the course of many playthroughs. The Grand Archives, a giant library full of spooky, cursed books. I found the archives really interesting my first time through, from the wax you use to keep yourself safe from curse buildup, to the freaky arms sprouting out of bookshelves. The Grand Archives has intriguing lore and doesn't fail to give off an uneasy feeling as you explore it. Once Liam and I had made our way to the top of the archives, we would finally battle with the final Lord of Cinder, Lothric, and his older brother Lorien, both crippled and fused together after their father Osiris failed in his attempt to bind their souls. It was tough, but as per usual, after many attempts and a ton of frustration, they were slain. Now, last but not least, it was time for Soul of Cinder. This was yet another extraordinarily difficult boss to overcome, but I loved every minute of it. Keep in mind, I had never played Dark Souls 1 at the time, and hadn't heard Gwyn's theme before this point, so when it hit, it was insane. Hearing this track for the first time literally gave me goosebumps, and to this day it still gives off a feeling of nostalgia and bliss whenever I hear it. I don't know much about music, but I know this song has something special about it. Anyways, the fight itself was almost equally as incredible. Soul of Cinder's different forms really changed the flow and pace of the battle, and had us constantly adapting to the range of all his different moves. The arena fit so well, and the sky and eclipse were breathtaking. It was a beautiful and cinematic ending to my playthrough. Taking down Soul of Cinder was so satisfying that I would go on to play and beat nearly every Soulsborne game, and I became a massive fan of the series. If you enjoyed the video, I'd really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed, and let me know in the comments what your first Soulsborne game was. Thank you so much for your time, and peace out.